This presentation deals with autocracy, or single power, single rule. The terms authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and fascism, though subtly different, they'll be used interchangeably throughout. 17th century ruler of France, Louis XIV, is purported to have said, "L'état c'est moi." That's the state, that's me, or I am the state. Encompasses the idea of autocracy in terms of controlling every aspect of society and the people that lived. Following the atrocities of Nazi Germany, many people, including students across all grades and ages, have asked, how did this happen? How did the atrocities of the Hitler and Nazi regime happen? We'll return to that throughout this presentation. In 1935, author Sinclair Lewis wrote "It Can't Happen Here" in response to the idea that, and this quote is from the end of chapter 3, why America's the only free nation on earth. Besides, country's too big for a revolution. No, no, it couldn't happen here. The idea that authoritarian takeover of the country could not happen here, and some of what uh, followed the war is trying to figure out what happened. In 1963, Stanley Milgram conducted a fairly famous experiment, behavior study of obedience, trying to answer that question. How did Nazi Germany, how did the people oppose their own values and undertake such atrocities? And what follows is a brief clip from that experiment.
150 volts. Answer horse.
Oh! Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
He refuses to go on.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
As you saw in that clip, that was at 150 volts, and it was labeled like you see on the left in that table. And what Milgram found so shocking was that the vast majority of participants took it all the way up, in fact, past the point of where it was a lethal shock, and they took it all the way. And this is what was so shocking to Milgram. In 1973, Milgram authored The Perils of Obedience after he had repeatedly conducted this experiment and continued to find very similar results. He wrote this for Harper's Magazine in 1973. The subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, and as the voltage continued to increase, the people on the other side of the screen would continue to scream out. Authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study. And all that the conductor, the researcher would say is, the experiment requires that you go on. It wasn't a specific direction, just the experiment requires that you go on. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo conducted this famous the Stanford prison experiment, and we saw him reference that a little bit in the video that we saw right at the beginning of Module 1 in that YouTube video. We'll revisit that in a little bit, but he took a group of student participants, separated them into prison guards and prisoners, and some of to study kind of the ideas of authority and control that happen supposedly organically. Taken from that video at the beginning of class where Philip Zimbardo talks about evil, he talked briefly about the prison study, and he summarized that he had ended what had been set up as a 2-week experiment, and he ended it after only 6 days because things became untenable. It had spun out of control. What he found is this supposedly organic uh, authority that the prison guards had uh, taken and lorded it over the prisoners. This created such tremendous stress in both populations, but it followed such a pattern where this autocracy, this unchecked authoritarian power, really set up a very unhealthy dynamic. Recently, researchers have gone through Zimbardo's prison experiment and looked through his lab notes and talked to participants. And what they found out is that Zimbardo, instead of the participants reacting organically or just spontaneously, they found that Zimbardo had actually primed them to behave in certain ways. And in this way, what we see, upon reflection, what we see is a lot more mirroring of Milgram's experiment and follow. You have Zimbardo as that authority, uh, instructing the prison guards in how to behave towards the prisoners. And so, as much as they have often been considered very separate, distinct experiments, the Milgram experiment and the Zimbardo experiment, the facts kind of lay bare the idea that they are far more similar and reflect this kind of the idea of authority resulting in this obedience and how that plays out. Now, just 4 years earlier and 3 miles away from Stanford was Coverly High School. And that's where we come back to this question asked in 1967. A high school student asked his history teacher how the German people could so easily follow Adolf Hitler. Ron Jones undertook an in-class experiment to answer that question. Ron darkened the room, he put on Wagner, and he introduced the idea of discipline to his class. Ron now required all his students to assume a proper seating posture. They must stand by the side of their desk, straight upright, and address him no longer as Ron or what, but they must address him as Mr. Jones and answer in short, concise responses, either questions or answers. They must be the model of punctuality and respect. This introduced the idea of a very regimented protocol for the class. After finishing up that first day, Ron figured that he'd come back the second day and debrief what had gone on and discuss how strength through discipline started to form a part of that authoritarian regime. However, when he came back, he found his whole class seated at the attention pose. And it was at this point in time that he'd gone from a designed lesson plan to an impromptu or improvised plan for the rest of the days that carried out this experiment. On that second day, he introduced the idea of strength through community. Handing out some index cards, students would make their own identification cards. They developed a hand salute, a C-shaped or wave-shaped salute that they would address each other with. These ideas built a sense of community among the participants. Part of strengthening that community and developing the idea of strength through community was making sure that that community was unified. And that meant that exiling anyone who was not 100% in the movement. By that third day, Ron took the ideas of strength through discipline and strength through community and integrated them into what do we want to accomplish. And so he introduced the idea of strength through action or strength through involvement. This meant that members of the wave, his classroom, would go out and recruit others to join the movement that he was building, the wave, the group that he had built within his class, and he would move it beyond the walls of that classroom out into the rest of the school. By the fourth day, Ron developed the idea of strength through pride, adding to his strength through community, strength through discipline, strength through action. And at this time, his classroom, normally 30 people, 30 students, had grown to over 80 students. He also introduced the idea that this was bigger than just his classroom, that this idea had grown into a national movement. Beyond recruiting, members of the Wave were sworn to an oath of secrecy amongst themselves, discussing the Wave only with members of the Wave. Taking it one step further, members of the Wave began to attack members of the student journalism classes, threatening them not to write about the Wave. In the final days of the Wave movement, or the Wave experiment, fights broke out between Wave members and non-Wave members, mock executions, exile and expulsion from the Wave, bodyguards surrounded various members of the Wave, and a growth of a resistance movement, or a fifth column called the Breakers, developed as well. So amongst this very tense time developed over a very short period. By the end, there were nearly 200 members of the Wave at the school. And Ron Jones, at this point in time, decided to introduce all the members of the Wave at a secret assembly that he held, where he would introduce the leader of the national movement, what was a climactic end of both the story and the experiment.
There's your leader.
Wird mehr gefordert als von den Millionen der übrigen Volksgenossen. Für sie genügt nicht die bloße Ablegung des Bekenntnisses, ich glaube, sondern der Spur, ich setze.
Now listen carefully. There is no national youth movement. You thought you were so special, better than everyone outside this room. You traded your freedom for the luxury of feeling superior. You accepted the group's will over your own convictions, no matter who you hurt. Oh, you thought you were just going along for the ride, that you could walk away at any moment. But where were you heading? How far would you have gone? Take a look at your future.
Als das Gebot ihres Herzens nichts hergerufen hat, als das Gebot ihrer Freude.
Yes, you would have all made good Nazis. You would have put on the uniforms, turned your heads, and allowed your friends and neighbors to be persecuted and destroyed. Fascism isn't something those other people did. It's right here in all of us.
Author and political philosopher Umberto Eco published in 1995 this now famous article, Fascism, which he outlined this development of a fuzzy collage of characteristics which coalesced around each other to represent a reactionary impulse to characteristics that were present in the society, which made a society especially susceptible to the development of totalitarian fascist regime. These 14 characteristics, they don't all have to be present, but they're, as he described, a fuzzy collage which kind of coalesce around each other. Traditionalism, rejection of modernism, irrationalism, analytical criticism, disagreement, social frustration, lack of social identity, humiliation, or by the wealthy and powerful, pacifism of the enemy, elitism, heroism, machismo, this selective populism, and newspeak as uh, making words not what they're supposed to mean. Despite perceptions, youth are still preoccupied with establishing a traditional household, preoccupied with marriage, preoccupied with children, thus reflecting this embedded uh, holding on to traditional values. Here we see this growing social strife, a resentment towards the super rich and disdain of the elites. Here we see the growth of this, what Eco called irrationalism, this anti-intellectualism. There's a broad denial of science. We see the growth of this selective populism that's targeting immigrants and religious and other minority groups for who are facing hate and violence. We see a lack of social identity symbolized by this growing epidemic of loneliness. In subtle ways, we see either the persistence or the growth of various features of Eco's 14 characteristics throughout our society. We see this partisan switch in this tendency towards autocracy, depending on which party is in power. In 2010, Hetherington Wheeler outlined their premise that this what we see is this growth of polarization, and that there is a correlation of authoritarianism and polarization in American politics. Looking at the screen once again, we see this growth over the past 3 years of this autocratic tendency among specifically Republicans. Returning to the third wave, there was nothing inherently evil or wrong about the elements that Ron Jones was promoting: discipline, community, action, involvement, pride. It's just how they got turned. And here again, we return to Philip Zimbardo, these principles or processes that grease the slippery slope of evil, mindlessly just taking that first small step, dehumanization of others, de-individuation of the self, diffusion of personal responsibility, blind obedience to authority, uncritical conformity to group norms, and passive tolerance of evil through inaction or indifference. Here again, in the third wave experiment, we had numbers of students who just went along with it, who didn't even necessarily believe it, but they passively went along with it. John Stuart Mills, delivering the inaugural address to the University of St. Andrews in 1867, told the students, "Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than good men should look on and do nothing." All three of these experiments that we looked at, the Milgram shock experiment, Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, and now Ron Jones's the wave lesson or experiment, all of those demonstrate just how easily and quickly some very dark things can start happening, and how susceptible normal, decent people are to the influence of evil. All three of these movies are fairly readily available. Lesson plan, as you can see, is available on Prime streaming or other streaming sources. The Wave, the 1981 version, which you saw some clips of during this presentation, that's available on YouTube, fairly easy to find. And De Wheel, that's a 2008 German language, but with English subtitles. it's another version of that story. It's more updated, and so it's also fairly readily available at pretty much any library, including the university library. Finally, returning to Philip Zimbardo on the issue of good and evil, dark and light, the idea that any good intention can be perverted and twisted into an evil outcome depending on the circumstances. Just leave you with one final clip from him, taken from Lesson Plan.
The perversion of the incredible power of the human mind that can do almost anything. All the magical things the human mind does in terms of creativity can get perverted to justify any evil, any transgression. People, the world is filled only with prisoners and guards, power and powerlessness. And you have a choice. You want to be powerless or you want to be powerful? Everybody wants to be more powerful than powerless. And the question is, what are you willing to pay? What are you willing to do to go from being powerless to being powerful? And for most people, it's an awful lot.